Hello everyone, today I would like to trace a parallelism between the relation in turn between Regnum and Sacerdotium, therefore its state and clergy, between the 6th and 9th century Europe. And this is really meant, telling the truth, to reconsider once again, as I like doing it at this point, considering the number of videos I made about it, the characteristics of the Carolingian and consequently post-Carolingian world in terms of relation between the aristocracy, let's say, because at a certain point centralized authority is nothing but, in practice, the rest of aristocracy in many ways, considering the fragmentation of political power, and the clergy, broadly meant, hence the ecclesiastical structures of archbishop, bishops, priests, etc., and monastic communities. And it's a parallelism that I want to trace because the 6th and the 9th century were centuries in Europe that actually had something in common, because we will be seeing right now there was a sort of convergence between state and clergy, in the measure in which the state was decently power for those times standards, and the clergy had a great cultural impact in the world, in society, in politics, etc. And there are two conditions that are obviously distanced by several centuries of history that represent themselves at this point. The the Carolingian world obviously stressed quite strongly the compenetration between Regnum and Sacerdotium for strictly pragmatic reasons. As we've said many times, the Carolingians were emerging from a world in which the public authority was really not part of the political culture of the Frankish world. The Merovingians had basically created their kingdom or empire, as you want to call it, since it extended itself over other peoples, in a completely private fashion. I mean, it is true that the Merovingians did, from the times of Clovis, manage to centralize and to kind of make the whole state revolve around them. But we can't really talk about state and centralization in the usual fashion, because differently from what was happening slowly but effectively, for instance in Lombard Italy, that was kind of more exposed to the Roman influences, if anything, because the local population was strongly Romanized. The Frankish kingdom, although so powerful and mighty already at that time in terms of political and military power, etc., was conceived as a private dominion. I mean, there was not a real statal structure. There was a Frankish administration, for which there were usually some counts that were appointed to go rule over other peoples, often. But we can say that the statal legacy of Roman or even of ecclesiastical origin was not really conceived. You know, the Franks at that time reasoned in a quite strongly Germanic fashion. They said, you know, we are the conquerors, we came here, and it's our personal right as conquerors, and in that case as the Merovingian family that had wiped out also the other all the other Frankish nobility, to use this land, because it's our property, and it's not ours because it belongs to our state. It's ours because it belongs to our pockets, literally. So just a minute, I drink because I already understand that I will keep coughing all the time if I don't. So it's stupid. I think I understand why I cough all the time after dinner. It's because I ate too mayonnaise. And it happens to me all the time. So it takes just to drink after a while, but it's strange because it comes back after I begin to talk, because I've already drank, but if I drink now, it passes away. So let's continue. And to make the long story short, the Merovingians basically destroyed their own empire because of this private, conception of their own domains. And there were other peoples, especially in Southern Europe, that were really reasoning, and Germanic peoples were reasoning in a quite different fashion. And it's fascinating because the Franks, however, were the ones who probably felt more entitled also relatively to their imperial legacy, in the sense that they believed, having got the vicariate over Gaul by the same Roman emperors, that they were kind of continuing the Roman rule over those lands. So in this sense, really, the Charles the Great and papacy in the year 800 didn't invent anything new, because this smell of the restoration of the Roman Empire was kind of there in the West since a very long time. Also, the Visigoths had a very Romanized mindset at that point. They wanted to emulate the court of Constantinople. Other peoples didn't weren't really much. Even the same Longobards who had been capable of creating a centralized administration, they thought of themselves as Longobards and nothing else, and if anything just protector of the Romans that they conquered. But this happened also at a very later stage. So the Franks theoretically had this very fascinating mix that, however, was kept alive in their private conception, relatively to the kingdom, into the Carolingian age, so that the Carolingian family rose to power exactly through the same mindset. They thought they were actually they were expecting the Merovingian legacy, because the Merovingians were had been capable really of stressing their own importance over everyone else. It's as if it was a matter of Merovingian blood to be king at that point. So even the Carolingians kind of respected as as first ministers, let's say, the Carolingian rule, even when it was extremely weak and they could have wiped it out, and they were confirmed as de facto and by right Frankish kings only because the Pope allowed that. So already by tributing to the Pope a superior a superior authority than the one of the earthly secular rulers, let's say. The problem is, however, that when the Carolingians managed to conquer through their clientelar system and their military aristocracy what they managed to conquer, that is literally half of Europe, they realized, especially Charles the Great and Louis the Pious, that they couldn't hold their empire for long if they hadn't abandoned this the private conception of public power. They needed to build something really public that could survive the even their own dynasty in some way. And that's where they recurred to the only actually can say properly public, but let's say self-standing and autonomous entity, that was the ecclesiastical one. And that's why the Carolingians began to say, okay, we can't, because they immediately realized that the system they had created couldn't be changed from the core, because the genetics of Carolingian power was based on private clienteles, and power was administered in that fashion, so that the Frankish aristocracy couldn't be convinced to do otherwise, and to think in turn that their own prerogatives were kind of personal, even if the beneficium, that is the fief, as it became in practice, was theoretically still a public domain. And therefore they tried to involve massively the church into the imperial administration. And I've made several videos about it. You can go check it out in the playlist Carolingian Europe. And this is very interesting because there is a relation between this and what had happened in the 6th century, because during the 6th century we will be seeing here the ecclesiastical aristocracies de facto were ruling great parts of Gaul and Spain at that time in the 6th century, and they were kind of a cultural elite, and they knew how to practically manage the empire, if anything, because when the Roman Empire had evaporated from the regions where they lived, they remained self-standing as the only let's say entity and structure that had survived from the Roman Empire in practice, because then the Germans came, and even though they massively, especially in Spain, exploited the Roman administration and became Roman in turn in practice, they still were the Visigoths. They were still something different from the empire. And the Merovingians had done something similar in France, with certain differences, because there is actually a great difference between the Merovingians and the Visigoths in the 6th century in relation with the church, because the Visigoths had practically institutionalized the ecclesiastical structure within the system of their own kingdom. And this wasn't really a good thing for the kingdom itself, because it practically meant to be that the church that had massive power in Spain, especially in central and southern Spain, became to limit the same monarchical power. This happened not because of the church in itself, but because the local aristocracies were kind of integrated into the Visigothic kingdom at the point that through the church could limit the newcomers' power, which is even a bit more complicated in this sense, because when the Visigoths came, partly certain Visigothic noblemen didn't like, obviously, the decentralized monarchical rule, and by mixing with local aristocracy of Iberian Roman ascendancy, they kind of mixed with it and began to play through the church, through the councils of Toledo especially, that were truly that they came even to elect the kings to in fact determine who was at power, and therefore resizing its power. In France this didn't happen, because in Gaul, telling the truth, the the church was very powerful, but especially in the north of Gaul, where the core of the Frankish kingdom was practically created, the Roman aristocracies really didn't exist that much. I mean, the Franks managed to occupy the whole land, because these were lands that were differently from southern Gaul, central and southern Gaul had been heavily depopulated. In fact, it seems that the same Franks were demographically consistent relatively to the local population, which is something rare because normally when the Germans came in other regions of Europe, especially in the south, that was the richest place, they were a strong minority in numerical terms. Here the Franks managed to seize everything, and at a certain point the Merovingians in turn managed to seize everything that belonged to the Frankish aristocracy. So basically what you had in France was an extremely powerful aristocracy, since the extremely powerful monarchy, excuse me, since the beginning. So with no competitor at all, like instead it was happening for the Visigothic kings in Spain, and the only interlocutors in the local Gallo-Roman society was the church. Churches that were, telling the truth, very powerful. There were certain dioceses that were extremely powerful. There are a lot of stories, and let's say that the story of Merovingian of Merovingian Gaul is largely the story of the relation, also in part between, especially from a cultural point of view. Think about a Gregory of Tours, etc., between the Merovingians and local bishops. Bishops that were practically um, aristocrats. They were noblemen. They had their own power. They most they were the chiefs of the cities that existed in there. So this the structure of the of Roman Gaul that the Franks inherited was still gravitating around these churches, as the public administration had vanished with the retreat of the Romans. So the Merovingians were in a position of being enough powerful to cooptate in some measure the the clergy with the with their own rule, not in the way the Carolingians would have done. I mean, giving them concrete statal offices, but let's say especially in terms of medium with local population. I mean, the Franks were immediately understood that if they wanted to rule over Gaul with a certain efficacy, they had to immediately accept the cultural influence, the cultural prestige of these bishops of Gaul. So they played, especially culturally, a very important role. And what happened in the Carolingian world instead was a very different thing, because at this point it was the decline of the same Merovingian Empire had brought to the same decline of the local church. Because in practice, when we think about these bishops, we're talking about men who came from the Gallo-Roman Senatorial class, so they were extremely cultured men for the time, some of the most cultured men in Europe at the time. Therefore they had inherited great skills, even in administration, etc. And what happened in the Frankish world is that when the Merovingians started to kill each other and to fragment the Frankish kingdom in basically four smaller kingdoms that had no great chance to recover singularly the world power, the local aristocracies and mostly the bishops had basically started to become lords on their own regard and to rule, especially in those lands of more ancient and deeper Romanization, like Aquitaine, Provence, so southern Gaul, but also in other places, and basically the decline of the Merovingian kingdom kind of happened in parallel with the secularization of the bishops' costumes and lifestyle, so that they wouldn't consider themselves much more as clergymen, but rather as Frankish lords. Also because these these families of Gallo-Roman senatorial origin would quite happily intermarry with the Frankish counts, which was a way to ensure a certain territorial rooting of a certain power, etc. The same Carolingians are famously descending from a Frankish count that married with the daughter of the Bishop of Metz, quite famously. So the concept that the bishop class would become as one with the Frankish comital one was there, and as a consequence, these bishops kind of got more barbaric in culture, which I don't want to use it in a contemporary fashion, but let's say that they really began to be less interested in letters, in their refined education coming from the Roman tradition, and instead minding about their own secular power in the mess that the late Merovingian times had become, in acquiring a freaking lot of power that eventually the Carolingians had to take back. You have to think that the Carolingian military elite was being built thanks to the territories that the Carolingians confiscated to these supposed clergymen that were instead usurpers of formal royal land that had managed to build up huge estates into France, and that in turn were given to the Carolingian counts so that they could wage war professionally on a regular base, and all what we know. So when the Carolingians rose to power, they were extremely they kind of rationalized the situation, especially when they reached the peak of their power, and they could boast to be, the rulers of the West in many ways, and they were in contact. They had become the protectors of the papacy. They had been called Roman emperors from that point of view. So they decided that in order to make the kingdom work, there had to occur a huge reform of the same clergy that, as far as we know, and we know it because the Carolingians checked it out, they couldn't even speak Latin anymore. I mean, they used to read the Bible, which was written in Latin, of course, because in the West at this point nobody spoke Greek. And telling the truth, the Westerners made a lot of mistakes also in translations during the local councils, ecclesiastical councils. If you think about the Filioque question, doctrine changing because you don't know how to translate correctly a word. This is the story of how it went, and therefore certain ecclesiastics they didn't even understand the Holy Scriptures, and the same Carolingians that weren't these very highly refined men of culture and who were ignorant like goats, telling the truth, even for the standards of the time. They basically understood that things couldn't go on that fashion anymore, and they decided to reform the church from an educational point of view. I mean, they had to restart having a qualified ecclesiastical elites, a well-structured church with a solid education, so that the Western Empire could have a church worth of this name. And what the Franks did in this sense was remarkable. I mean, many people ask, but what did the Carolingians ever did for us? Well, indeed, the so-called Carolingian rebirth as a as a comprehensive phenomenon is a myth, in the sense that the Carolingian world didn't really achieve anything substantial in terms of progress, of advancement. It was actually a very big redistribution of resources. for which we have to, tell the truth, admire the Franks, because they achieved to do something nobody had done. They deeply transformed Europe in many ways, but if there is one thing that they managed to do extremely well, was the reform of the church and all the cultural consequences that derived from it, because what the Carolingian Empire vanished as it had been formed, essentially. And in fact, it was a pretty fortunate event that it even existed, because for dynastic dynamics could even not be there, telling the truth. But they managed to leave behind as a legacy one enormous thing, that was the reform of culture that emanated exactly from the ecclesiastical centers that eventually managed to build, even in post-Carolingian times, where there was no centralized authority, where basically every count did whatever he liked, to carry on a sort of unified civilization that we can't call fully European at this point, because eventually it was exported, during the low Middle Ages. The expansion of the West was essentially happened essentially through the expansion of the Frankish models, for obviously for how they had been transformed this time, even from a secular point of view. So things that had gone even straight from the church, the ecclesiastical ideas and hopes, but that had, however, at the base the idea of literacy, the idea of manuscripts, of knowledge, that were all things that were carried out by the clergymen at this point. So the Franks really, we owe the Franks really the intellectual growth of the European episcopal class, as well as the development, the great encouragement to the development of monastic studies that start really in Carolingian times. And this is, to me, the greatest things I think that the Franks have achieved, because without the Carolingians really at this point, and without what they did under this point of view, I don't know if there would be, surely there would be a very different Western civilization. I don't know whether we could even call ourselves Westerners. I think that the Carolingians did a freaking lot to create a sort of uniform Western identity in many ways. They didn't know that, but their plan was implicitly that, because the idea of recreating an empire that was, however, recreated on a Frankish base, meant that everything that the Carolingians were doing was thought to become the base of something greater, not just the greatness of the Franks, but really the restoration of the Roman Empire with all that this would have implied. So from a secular point of view, they completely failed, even though this failure brought very deep and very base consequences to that, the feudalism and chivalry, etc. I think how much that actually affected us as well. But from the ecclesiastical point of view, it was a marked success. This is my opinion, but I believe in great outlines. This is really this is really what happened. And we're talking about the excuse me, I drink a little bit more. Here we go. Back once again. Caffeine once again. And when we think about the Carolingian reform of the church, we don't have to think just about culture at this point, in history of culture, literary production, but really at the history of institution and of the social basis, broadly meant, because as we were saying before, the Carolingians pushed the ecclesiastical reform for mainly institutional reasons. They wanted the clergy, with all its cultural potential, to become a new administrative class of the empire. And this wasn't really a coincidence, for those times mentalities, because if you think that in a Christian perspective, it basically means that you are trying to rebuild a world that works thanks to the church in many ways. So by re-educating the clergy, Charles the Great, Louis the Pious were really thinking about giving new life to a Christian world that had decayed, because these guys felt really what had happened to the empire, now to the Roman Empire. Now they were trying to re-emulate that. They were trying to put it together and to do it on strictly ecclesiastical basis, because the Carolingians believed, probably like most Germans, that the Romans were a bit of a corrupted race, that they had failed because they were kind of morally unfit to the role. They were too they had paid because God had condemned them. I mean, even if you reason just in Christian terms, for those time standards, if an empire had gone down, it's because God, first of all, had wanted that, but secondly, because, and this was more, kind of a contractual minded attitude, but it was very widespread at that point, that the empire had done so bad that it kind of deserved to fall. So the Carolingians at that point were thinking of themselves as the new Jews, as the new Romans, like the new chosen people of God. Wanted to recreate also, in order not to make their empire fall in turn, a society that was supported by an ecclesiastical and therefore a pure and reformed institution, according to the Christian models, that could lead the empire towards a sort of celestial destiny. The differences, however, were striking at this point between what had happened in the 6th century and what was happening in the 9th century Carolingian world, because there was a kind of, while in the 6th century there was a Roman legacy into the clergy, for which they knew practically how to administrate the Roman world from a legal point of view, from a social point of view, not just as preachers, as priests, etc. In the Carolingian times, the class from which the church was, the clergy was drawn, was the same military aristocracy. It was creating so many problems to the Carolingians. And they couldn't really do much differently, in the sense that the Carolingian aristocracy would have not backed the imperial policy if newcomers had been inserted into this new parallel administration. The guys that became bishops and abbots in the Carolingian world all came from the same families of the counts that were progressively tearing apart the empire. And although the strictly educational plans of the Carolingians worked, because indeed the Frankish clergy reacquired a quite strong and very high level of culture for the standards of the time. They were still reasoning in great part in that famous private mindset that was undeletable from the Frankish customs. So that this is why bishops and abbots basically became lords in post-Carolingian times as much as the rest of the aristocracy, because they were the same people. they were the same families, they were the same systems, and even the beneficia, the fiefs that they had received from the Carolingian administration were the same, of the same nature. It was land, with people living on it, with clienteles tied to the masters, and therefore there is an evident contradiction to even the same Carolingian plans, and that tells you that um, there was really nothing they could do at that point. But yet they kind of worked something out, um, to to at least to have a point of reference, because even in post-Carolingian times there was a king, there was there was a public authority, for it doesn't matter how weak it was. And in this sense, for the development, for the gestation of certain kingdoms, for instance, that survived from the post-Carolingian mess and would make it to become something greater in low medieval Europe, the clergy was a very important structure to rely on. I mean, bishops, abbots were usually faithful to the crown, because especially they weren't really as militarized, at least not completely, as the rest of the aristocracy. They knew that they had, in a certain sense, more rights from their ecclesiastical position to be recognized by the king. Um, they didn't really inherit their own properties, so, and yet the single ecclesiastical or monastic entity inherited it, in spite of who was administering it. So the kings would be happier to give land and privileges to the church. That was something that in theory you could change its head, um, of whom you could change the head with the election of a different bishop, etc. While with lay aristocracy, at that point it basically was many dynasties that were forming, and with inheriting rights, meaning that you couldn't, even if a lord died, his son would feel perfectly entitled to inherit everything that his father had, and that was a typical Frankish and Germanic tradition that hadn't been couldn't be taken away, and that exactly in those centuries was instead exactly strengthening its own prerogatives. In many ways, this is how it went. I mean, I've always found Carolingian history fascinating for this reason, because it was such a big thing, really, that happened to Europe, but it was still done by many people at once. I mean, it was a general direction given by imperial authority or royal authority, but there was a kind of a new system that was formed as a consequence, that had part of public, that was partly looking at the public authority and partly looking at the private one. And this is true both for the lay and ecclesiastical aristocracy. Um, so um, and it's very interesting also, by the way, that the original synthesis that this system brought to, because in a certain sense the church had to be ideally the element that said, let's put down arms, let's start to act in a brotherly fashion. Let's say, let's not solve problems with violence. Let's give us a civil address, etc. But at the same time, these guys were really using the sword. So I find, from a cultural point of view, especially, extremely fascinating the synthesis and how of these two cultures, and how the clergy, that was the one that produced culture and works and literature at that times, and political propaganda, institutional political theory, institutional theory, was able to kind of justify what was going on. I know it's contradictions, and how anyway there was truly a very deep Christian thinking into that. I mean, it was kind of hypocritical in many ways, but at the same time, it still survived. I mean, it was still part of the same system that made people oppressed, that made it waging war all the times, that increased social inequality, that sowed the most atrocious fights between the aristocracy, but yet bishops and abbots, while doing partly that in first person, they were also capable of looking through that, in a very intelligent fashion and say, yeah, but there is kind of a justice in all this. There is a kind of moral that has to be maintained. And maybe we can make coexist the aristocratic, warlike Germanic ethics with this world and successfully integrated it in the Christian society, which is what they managed to do historically speaking. Think of the Crusades. Think about the knight as protector of the Christian society. And it was a very difficult process. It was a very long process because obviously the aristocracy, was namely Christian, but they didn't give a damn about that. When it came to wage their wars, to increase their power, and to do whatever the hell they liked. But yet, the Christian institutions managed to give a certain address to that, to give a certain moral frame to that. They kind of catalyzed the whole process at the point that Christian Europe was fully formed from an institutional point of view, and when the national monarchies finally arose, the Christian the ecclesiastical structures were there, backing them and approving that and making civilization turn. With all the interests, with all the individual weaknesses and deviations, etc., but still being part of a Christian system that worked politically and ecclesiastically speaking. And I think this is very relevant to explain European history in many ways. And today was a bit more of a general reflection about these topics, but I think there is something good that can be drawn from this. So I hope you at least a little appreciated my my rambles. For now, I end here. So if you like this video, please share it or leave a like, otherwise subscribe to my channel. And if you have any question, please feel free to ask. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.